today, and I want to thank you for joining us today. My name is Stephanie Goodwin, and I am the Acting Executive Director for Communications and Operations for BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. We're meeting today on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. It is important to locate ourselves this morning because of the historical and ongoing colonialism that has a deep and devastating impact on Indigenous people and communities. And we have an individual and a collective responsibility to right relations with Indigenous people of these lands. I want to thank you for joining us for the launch of our inaugural report titled Rights in Focus, Lived Realities in BC. This report highlights 10 key human rights issues impacting people across the province. I want to welcome our distinguished guests, our members from the Council of Advisors and community connectors and conveners that have formed this report, and members of the media for joining us today. The format of this press conference will be remarks from the Human Rights Commissioner, Kasari Govender, followed by remarks from leading experts in British Columbia on several of the issues in the report, and concluding with a question and answer period. There are hard copies of the report available to those in the room to browse, and an electronic copy is now available on our website at bchumanrights.ca. For those joining us virtually, you can use the chat function if you have any technical difficulties or questions that you'd either like to ask or that you want to ask privately, so that one of our online moderators can provide you with some support. I want to let people know who are here in the room that if you need to use the restroom, you can just exit the doors, go to the right, and follow the hallway all the way around. There is water and coffee and tea in the back. You're welcome to help yourself, and there are copies of the executive summary that you're welcome to take home with you. Now, to introduce our Rights in Focus, Lived Realities in BC report, I'm going to introduce BC's Human Rights Commissioner, Kasari Govender. Commissioner Govender began her work as BC's first independent Human Rights Commissioner in 2019. As an independent officer of the legislature, Commissioner Govender is uniquely positioned to ensure human rights in BC are protected, respected, and advanced on a systemic level. In her first 5-year term, her work included a public inquiry into experiences of hate during the pandemic, a report on systemic discrimination in policing, community-embedded research on a range of human rights issues, public awareness campaigns about ableism and racism, and significant contributions to government that, among other things, informed the creation of both the Anti-Racism Data Act and the Anti-Racism Act. Commissioner Govender was reappointed for a second term beginning in September 2024. I invite Commissioner Kasari Govender to the podium.
Thank you, Steph. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us here today. I want to ground my comments in my gratitude and responsibility we owe first and foremost to Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples on whose land we are now standing. We are here today to launch our new report, as you've heard, Rights in Focus. We're very excited to be here with you today for this important event. The report, Rights in Focus, Lived Realities in BC, details 10 systems which are essential to the fulfillment of our human rights. The report details the inequities that are built into these systems. Exploring these systems is an important way to determine the state of human rights in BC. The systems selected for the Rights in Focus report are the primary systems impacting our social, economic, and political lives, and they reflect what we heard from community members about where human rights issues most often show up in our lives. Our selection of issues is likely unsurprising to most people. These issues are top of mind for many British Columbians. However, it may not be as obvious how these issues impact the most marginalized people in our communities and how they are, at their heart, human rights issues. That's why we've released this report, to put rights into focus. We intend to replicate this Rights in Focus report every 3 years and examine the same key issues with different spotlights on lived experience. My hope is that this series will provide a useful snapshot of human rights issues facing British Columbia, showing where there are opportunities to create social and legal change, and how the human rights landscape is evolving over time. My office developed this first report of the series by conducting community-based research, a survey of direct service organizations, sectoral community grants, and secondary research. Most importantly, this report is based on deep listening to communities of people with lived experience on human rights. And I want to thank each and every person, organization, and community who shared their experiences and perspectives. I hope this report does your words justice. Before I speak to the human rights issues in each of the key systems that we examined, I want to spend a few minutes reviewing both the purposes and the parameters of the report. As mentioned, BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner initiated this project to capture the current state of human rights in the province, creating a kind of baseline that can be used to monitor change over time. Our goals of this work include increasing public awareness about the state of human rights across this province and educating decision makers, the government, and other duty-bearing institutions, as well as leveraging opportunities to create change. This report is not a comprehensive look at every human rights issue in the province, nor does it contain a detailed policy analysis or recommendation for change. Instead, this report is intended to reflect what we heard in community and what secondary and survey research show us about the issues creating and perpetuating inequalities and injustices in the province. Our hope is that this report will be helpful to advocates and decision makers alike in their work devising solutions to these issues. Many of the systems we review are relevant to the protection of our economic and social rights, our rights to the necessities of life. International human rights law obligates governments to take appropriate steps towards the full realization of these rights. Yet our report details where we are falling short of these commitments in regard to housing, income supports, the workforce, the education system, and the healthcare system. In our research, unaffordable, inaccessible, and inappropriate housing quickly and unsurprisingly rose to the top of the human rights issues facing British Columbians. BC residents face the highest rate of unaffordable housing in Canada. This is part of why homelessness and encampments are on the rise. In 2023, homeless counts identified 31% more people experiencing homelessness when compared to 2021. The effects are particularly acute for certain populations of people. Violence against women is a leading cause of homelessness, and increased violence is one of its effects. Young women without homes are at high risk of violence of all kinds. 63% have been assaulted, and 37% have been sexually assaulted. We heard from service providers that many women cannot leave abusive partners, only to return after they cannot find safe, affordable housing for their families. As one provider put it, they are given the difficult choice of violence on the street or violence at home. Our right to housing is intimately connected to the right to an adequate standard of living, which often depends on the social safety net of minimum wage and social assistance. Currently, the social safety net falls short. About 1 in 9 residents, or 11.6%, lives in poverty as of 2022, an increase from 7.6% from 2 years before. Our research shows that discrimination entrenches conditions of poverty. For example, we heard about employers screening out job applicants from low-income neighborhoods, and people who appear to be experiencing poverty being denied services, including public transportation and even medical care. Despite stigma and discrimination facing people living in poverty, such discrimination is not prohibited by law, although I have issued repeated recommendations for change on this, echoing years of advocacy from community. An adequate standard of living can also be impacted by systemic inequalities within the workforce. For example, compared with men, women are more likely to work part-time and earn only 68 cents for every dollar. Indigenous people are less likely than non-Indigenous people to hold secure jobs. People with disabilities are significantly less likely than other groups to be employed, yet a recent estimate by Statistics Canada suggested over 40% of adults with disabilities who are not currently employed would be able to work in accessible workplaces. Workers who come to BC temporarily via the Temporary Foreign Workers Program are especially vulnerable, as their immigration status is tied to their employment. For example, some workers we met describing put in housing that is moldy, unventilated, and either freezing cold or boiling hot, and being put on curfews and denied guests, even including advocacy workers. We've also highlighted inequalities in the healthcare system, something I've heard repeatedly across BC. The right to healthcare entitles everyone to the highest attainable standard of health, yet in BC, many people lack access to basic care. Indigenous people report widespread discrimination in trying to access services where stereotypes can result in a denial of services and serious bodily harm. People with marginalized identities live shorter lives, report worse mental health, and experience discrimination in the healthcare system. The healthcare system has been overburdened not just by the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the toxic drug crisis, which is killing thousands of BC residents every year. Yet people seeking treatment face significant barriers, including inadequate staffing, confusing access requirements, and insufficient social reports. Marginalization of drug users, often intersecting with other forms of marginalization, has been a key barrier to implementing and advancing these supports. In regard to the realization of the right to education, we found that there are large differences between groups on educational outcomes in the province. Evidence shows that groups with worse outcomes face exclusion, racism, and discrimination in schools. For example, 92% of all students complete secondary school within 6 years, but only 78% of students with disabilities and 75% of Indigenous students. We spotlight the experiences of LGBTQ2SAI+ students in schools and controversy around the SOGI 123 program, an supplementary educational resource designed to create inclusive educational spaces for the growing number of people who identify within this community. The high level of mis- and disinformation about these programs undermines the right to education for trans and gender diverse youth. Other systemic inequalities we examined relate to our rights to bodily and psychological safety and equality in both public and private spaces. The right to fair treatment in public spaces entitles everyone to free and full participation in social, political, and cultural life. In recent years, this right has come into threat from a rise in hate and far-right movements that aim to silence the voices of marginalized people. Hate is common both in outdoor public spaces and online. 1 in 5 Canadians, nearly 1 in 3 racialized people, have experienced some form of hate, harassment, or violence online. Hate incidents rose dramatically during the COVID-19 pandemic and again in response to recent events such as the violence in Gaza. This rise is reflected in police-reported hate crimes, but also in the many incidents not reported to police. As trust in institutions falls, hate is increasingly grounded in mis- and disinformation shared online, such as racist conspiracy theories about the COVID-19 virus, denial of graves at Indian residential schools, and protests of SOGI 123. The right to safety and equality extends to the family sphere. More than 3/4 of police reported intimate partner violence for women and girls. The family law legal aid system is drastically underfunded, which puts more women and girls and gender diverse people at risk of family violence. Other systems also increase risk. For example, one Indigenous woman described how she was afraid to call the police or to seek medical assistance based on past experiences that made her fear that further harm would come to her through the criminal justice and healthcare systems. In addition to these issues, freedom from undue state influence also rose to the top of the issues that we examined. The right to fair treatment in the criminal justice system entitles everyone to equitable treatment by police and correctional institutions. Indigenous and racialized people, as well as people with mental health or substance use disorders, are at severely increased risk of interactions with the criminal justice system. For example, on any given day in 2023, about 1,829 individuals were in BC correctional centres, and over 2/3 were dealing with mental health or substance use issues. Many people with these issues receive treatment in correctional centres, but they are often subject to traumatizing uses of force, such as segregation, which can create additional risks for people with these disorders after discharge. For example, rates of fatal overdose more than triple shortly after leaving custody. The child protection system is also a key way in which the state runs up against liberty issues, or liberty rights. While the number of children and youth in care has decreased in recent years, the child welfare system disproportionately affects children from marginalized families, particularly those who are Indigenous, experiencing poverty, or living with disabilities. For example, despite making up only 10% of the population, 68% of children and youth in care are Indigenous. Children and youth are normally placed in care due to so-called neglect, yet their families often face systemic barriers that masquerade as neglect, but are in fact outside of parental control. Examples include the absence of affordable housing and mental health supports. For children and youth with disabilities, a lack of resources during critical developmental periods can result in health consequences that cascade into other inequities throughout their lifetime. Resources are gated behind diagnosis, but not all diagnoses are treated equally. Families are pushed to the limit, and some consider giving up their children in order to access support. Finally, we have highlighted that all human rights depend on a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Climate change, extreme weather, pollution, and other environmental crises threaten this crucial foundation to human existence. The harm falls disproportionately on marginalized people who have contributed least to the crisis and whose rights are already least secure. This was evident in recent years as unprecedented flooding, heat waves, and wildfires destroyed biodiversity, lives, and property across the province. Government response to these events has also raised human rights issues, as, for example, temporary foreign workers were impacted by the 2021 flooding through the Fraser Valley. Indigenous people remain experts in climate adaptation, but their voices have too often been discounted by mainstream initiatives. Centering Indigenous perspectives can revitalize climate adaptation strategies, as has been recently seen in wider recognition of cultural burning and Indigenous fire stewardship. The systemic inequalities highlighted in this report impact all of us, but disproportionately harm those who are marginalized in our society. The 10 issue areas that are described here are not experienced in isolation. Many residents of BC experience violations of their human rights in multiple areas of life, in ways that intersect and compound the harm that they're experiencing. It is only with understanding that we can act. While this report focuses on where we continue to fall short in upholding the rights of British Columbians, we also honor the many powerful ways people in all walks of life are resisting oppression, standing up for human rights, and disrupting systems to create better ones. My hope is that this report will help us see these issues more clearly as human rights problems, and that this clarity will serve as a catalyst for change. Thank you again for being with us today, and I look forward to any questions you may have after the other speakers have had a chance to share their perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Govender. Our next speaker is Zoe Craig-Sparrow. Zoe is a human rights scholar, an Indigenous feminist academic, and co-director of Justice for Girls, focusing on Indigenous rights and environmental justice. She is a member of the Must Be an Indian Band. Zoe.
Israel, and the Zoe Craig-Sparrow. Good day, everyone. My name is Zoe, and I'm from Musqueam and grew up on the Musqueam Reserve in Vancouver. I am the daughter of Laura Sparrow and James Craig, and the granddaughter of Edward and Susan Sparrow and Joe and Julie Craig. I am proud to be Justice for Girls as Director of Indigenous Rights and Environmental Justice, and to be part of our long history of advocating for the rights of Indigenous girls and for environmental justice. I am also proud to work with the BC Office of the Human Rights Commissioner on their circle of advisors and as a community convener grant recipient, and supported their efforts to meaningfully engage with Indigenous peoples, communities, and rights defenders to understand the complexity and intersectionality of our lived experiences and human rights violations. Human rights are inherently intersectional. Their protection and fulfillment is not only a legal imperative, but in the best interest of equality and justice for all. The realization of human rights is indivisibly connected to the protection of the lands, waters, and natural world where Indigenous peoples have lived and stewarded since time immemorial. The Rights in Focus report emphasizes that climate change is an unchecked threat to the foundation of human rights, and that BC is far from on track to meeting its legislated emissions reductions under the Climate Change Accountability Act. Despite this, the province continues to issue permits for fossil fuel projects will drastically increase pollution levels. To be clear, we are already far overshooting our reduction targets with current emissions and fossil fuels projects, and this will only get worse with the approval of new ones. Environmental degradation and climate change does not affect all people equally. It amplifies the harms of colonization, genocide, violence, and systemic racism that Indigenous people already face, threatening our culture, health, territory, land, waters, and rights. While it is Indigenous people's rights that are violated and threatened, we view it as our responsibility to steward the lands, waters, and environment for today and for generations to come. Protecting the natural world is both a cornerstone of Indigenous cultures and ways of knowing, and enshrined in the laws of many Indigenous nations and communities. And despite this, Indigenous peoples continue to be criminalized for exercising these rights. Indigenous children are also overrepresented in the child welfare system, and Indigenous women are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, facing extreme and genocidal levels of violence, as well as poverty and other deeply rooted and pervasive inequalities as a result of colonization. One of the 10 key issues in the Rights in Focus report is the inequalities in the criminal justice system, reinforcing the need for the BC Human Rights Commission's upcoming report based on their inquiry on police use of force. Indigenous women and girls are not only over-policed and over-criminalized, they are also underprotected and even abused by the police. In 2012, after over a decade of responding to police abuses of Indigenous girls and failures to respond to violence, Justice for Girls called on Human Rights Watch to investigate. We worked on with them throughout their investigation, which resulted in the 2013 report, Those Who Take Us Away, Abusive Policing, Failures in Protection of Indigenous Women and Girls in Northern BC. We've continued to advocate for independent, gender-specific investigations of violence against women and girls, for police accountability and oversight, and to raise awareness and end the genocide of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We also advocate for Indigenous land defenders against forced eviction, criminalization, police violence, and human rights violations associated with climate change, resource extraction, and environmental degradation. These issues, and all 10 key issues outlined in this report, must be addressed from a human rights perspective that is informed by and led by people from the community. Organizations like ours have decades of experience advocating for human rights. The BC Office of Human Rights Commissioner's efforts to follow our leadership and raise awareness, create change, build connections is a good example of the type of engagement and work necessary to make meaningful change, to increase action, and call for accountability. And Indigenous peoples have not only been sounding the alarms for decades, we've stewarded these lands since time immemorial and have intergenerational knowledge, rights, and responsibilities we fight to uphold. The leadership of marginalized individuals and communities and organizations that have been advocating alongside them was critical to the development of this report and is critical to addressing these human rights issues. It is also critical for all British Columbians to be aware of their rights and to know what the biggest threats to human rights are in our province. I encourage everyone to read this report in its entirety and to research and learn more about real human rights. I hope that this report is the wake-up call that we all need to take human rights and the threat of climate change and environmental degradation seriously, as we are compelled to do not only under domestic and international human rights law, but also under Indigenous law. Hi, Sepka. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Zoe. Our next speaker today is Raji Mecca. Raji is a lawyer practicing in the areas of constitutional and administrative law. She is the Executive Director for West Coast Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, also known as West Coast LEAF, an organization dedicated to achieving substantive gender equality. Her recent work has focused on access to justice, the impact of detention on women, and family law. I want to welcome up Raji.
Thank you. I'm here today as the Executive Director of West Coast LEAF, where we work to deepen justice and substantive equality for women and people who experience gender-based discrimination. I'm pleased to join you all at the launch of the Rights in Focus report. This is a vital resource that all of us, community advocates and policymakers alike, can use to monitor and assess BC's progress towards a more equal and just society. The 10 systems highlighted in the report do not exist in a vacuum. Systemic inequities are not random. They reflect societal assumptions, prejudices, and value judgments. Systems might sound kind of abstract, but the impacts of systemic discrimination are stark and real, felt deeply by those facing multiple forms of oppression. The inequities reported on are at their core about how different people are valued differently. Some of us are trusted and heard, while others are doubted and dismissed. Some of us are warmly welcomed and supported. We can ask for what we need and feel safe doing so. But others are scrutinized, constantly under surveillance and policed, all under the guise of safety. The report illustrates how systemic inequities manifest at school, at work, at the doctor's office, out on the street, and significantly at home. The report's recognition of inequities in the family sphere and in what we refer to at West Coast LEAF as the family policing system, or what you may know as the child welfare system, is an important and very welcome development. Human rights are not a coat that you leave on a hook by your front door. You don't just put them on when you go outside and then shrug them off when you come home. The report draws attention to power imbalances within the home and how socioeconomic inequities impact our home lives and our interactions with the state and the legal system. It also calls on us to look at how, under the guise of child protection and safety, our government is making investments in separating families rather than in supporting them. At West Coast LEAF, we've seen how the systems that should be supporting families to thrive are instead policing them. Ableist, classist, and racist assumptions about parenting and safety discriminate against parents, violate parents' and children's human rights, and alienate children from their caregivers and cultures. Families are navigating poverty, chronic lack of housing, inadequate income and disability rates, lack of holistic health and wellness supports, and a whole range of other systemic issues. Yet these systemic failures are placed squarely on the shoulders of families and kinship caregivers, judging them harshly through a lens of risk and surveillance. The resulting impact is too great. Families are torn apart, and children, families, Indigenous nations, and communities are left to face catastrophic cultural and intergenerational harm. The report also highlights how the undervaluing of all forms of caregiving labor is at the heart of many human rights violations impacting women and people marginalized on the basis of their gender. Inequities in areas such as employment, housing, and healthcare are magnified for racialized, disabled, and migrant women and gender diverse people. They have fewer options to safely leave an abusive ex-partner. The feminization of poverty contributes to their insecurity. The report's spotlight on parental alienation reveals how legal concepts, the litigation process, and myths and stereotypes about people experiencing interpersonal violence can become weaponized. This puts people seeking safety in an impossible situation. Risk having your experiences of violence and abuse minimized or dismissed altogether. Risk having your efforts to protect yourself and your children recast somehow as outrageous attempts to alienate your children from an abusive ex. And risk losing contact or primary caregiving responsibility for your children. Against those odds, it should come as no surprise that many survivors of family violence feel they have no choice but to remain in an unsafe home, stay silent about the violence they're experiencing, or bargain away their legal entitlements to avoid more harm. The Rights in Focus report highlights the diverse yet interconnected systems that feature in everyday experiences of oppression in our province. The report is a call to action to the BC government and to us all to commit to meaningful change and confront the systemic equities that pervade every aspect of our lives. Now more than ever, we need to move beyond surface level solutions and address root causes of injustice and inequity that so many people in our province are facing. I join Zoe's call in encouraging you all to read the report and to think about how you can support the important work of promoting human rights in our province. Thank you.
Thank you, Raji. Our next speaker is Dawn Hemingway. Dawn is a University of Northern British Columbia Professor Emerita, recently retired after more than 20 years, including 14 years as chair for the School of Social Work. Professor Hemingway continues in a leadership role with the Feminist Institute for Research and Evaluation, Women North Network, Community Partners Addressing Homelessness, and a range of community and research roles focused on ensuring a good quality of life for all, with particular attention to engaging women, older community members, and those experiencing precarity. Dawn.
Thanks very much, and hello everybody. First, I would like to again recognize the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, such gorgeous part of the country, and raised here, but now also have to say we have gorgeous territories of the Tsleil-Waututh in north central BC. So I'm forever grateful for these beautiful lands. And I'd really like to thank the Commissioner and all the staff who've done the work on this report, and for organizing this event and giving us the opportunity to come together and to learn from the Rights in Focus report that includes, importantly, powerful voices, organizing work, research, and concerns of people from across the province. I think these opportunities are crucial to recognize, to share, and to amplify the voices of so many. And I should say up front that my starting point is the view that we all have human rights by virtue of the fact that we are human beings on this earth. It's not because we have a UN covenant or a declaration or even the Human Rights Code that say we have these rights. No matter who we are or where we are, I believe we have those rights. Whether these rights are honored and respected is another matter. So, when thinking about today, two thoughts come to mind for me. On the one hand, the work of the Human Rights Commissioner and this report bring to the fore so many injustices that persist and need to be remedied. For example, I think about the need for the implementation, and not just words, of the Human Rights Code, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, all the recommendations from the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, the legally established rights to lands and resources, to Indigenous child welfare, and much more. I also think of the challenges still faced by migrant and temporary foreign workers, the discrimination in wages, working conditions, legal status, a lack of equality. And these things remain forefront of my mind. I think about the negative and totally unacceptable experiences of so many Indigenous and racialized communities, those with disabilities, members of the LGBTQ2SIA+ communities, women's communities, older persons, those who are living on limited incomes or without a roof over their heads as they try to seek access to health care, to education, to housing, employment, livable incomes, and so much more. And importantly, I think about our natural environment, the undermining and destruction that is taking place and disproportionately impacting so many, and ultimately undermining the lives of future generations. We need to harmonize. The harmony needs to exist between the natural and social environments. And importantly, I think about the structural issues that are embedded in our socioeconomic system, both past and present. These are at the very foundation of discriminatory practices and the failure to meet the basic needs of every person. We live in a world that has the resources and the know-how to do precisely that. On the other hand, when I think about the report, it also brings to the fore and makes me think about the determined voices, actions, and research initiatives of so many working so hard to bring about positive change. So many community organizations, agencies, community members, working with such heart and determination and collective will to address the needs and rights of everyone, and importantly, working collectively, overcoming the challenges that would have us working in silos, finding that path that brings us together as a powerful voice for change. And isn't this how we've always brought change about historically? People speaking up, organizing themselves together to have their voices heard and their objectives realized. In short, for me, we are one humanity. Our collective future lies in ensuring the rights of everybody. And I think this work of the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner is making a critical contribution to furthering the organizing and voices that are existing across our province, trying to bring about these changes that represent the rights of every single person. And I really want to underline the comments of the previous two speakers about the importance of people looking at this report. Think about it, about all the intersections that exist and the responsibilities we each have and the capacity we have as peoples across the province to bring about these changes. So I really thank you very much for the opportunity to share those few words.
Thank you so much, Dawn. Thank you, Commissioner Govender. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Raji, for sharing the report and for your expertise. This concludes the remarks portion of the press conference. I will now turn it over to Lindsay Bertrand, Communications Manager for the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, to moderate the question and answer period.
All right, bring that in. All right, thank you, Steph, and thank you again to Commissioner Govender and to our speakers for your insightful comments. So as Steph mentioned, we are now in the Q&A portion of the press conference, and so for media in the room, Please feel free to just raise your hand or otherwise indicate that you have a question and I'll aim to call anyone first come, first served basis. And I'll ask that you keep your questions brief and to the point and that you limit yourself to just one follow-up question after you receive this response to ensure that we have time for everyone. So let's jump right in. I think it's Zara.
I don't know if I need that, my voice is kind of gloomy. This one is for the commissioner. Perhaps you could speak to the greatest sources of resistance to changing these harmful status quos that you have identified in this report.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think there's longstanding patterns of inequality in our society, including the very basis of our country in the context of colonialism. And that big picture, kind of more theoretical answer really boils down to some very practical forms of discrimination. We're at a point in our development, I think, as a society, as a legal culture, that much of our very explicit inequalities have been changed. We don't have as big, on the books, we look fairly equal. But I think what we need to do is to shift our thinking to understanding how our laws, our policies, our systems impact people disproportionately. And that's the kind of analysis that we've used here so that we can see those longstanding patterns, how those longstanding patterns are showing up. To give you an example, we can see that Indigenous children are far overrepresented and Indigenous families are far overrepresented in the child welfare system. That's not because there's discrimination in the face of the law necessarily, but it's how the law operates, or a really disproportionate number of Indigenous people who are incarcerated. Thank you.
This one is for Ms. Quick-Sparrow, and it might be a little specific and outside of your purview. I know that I have been trying to contact your organization over your legal challenge to the flotel in Squamish. Can you speak to the status of that legal challenge at all? Is that something that you're familiar with? I know that the flotel was the subject of more than one, but the one that I was trying to explore specifically was the one filed by Justice for Girls.
Yes, so Justice for Girls is choosing to pursue other means of justice for Indigenous women and girls and peoples located in Vancouver and surrounding areas who are going to be directly impacted by this project. This project is a prime example of the intersectionality of human rights issues in this province and the connection between environmental justice, resource extraction, climate change, and violence against Indigenous women and girls. And Justice for Girls is working very hard to raise attention to the real community impacts and environmental impacts of these projects. So we are currently launching various campaigns, social media campaigns, and educational campaigns. For more specifics on the legal process there, I can direct you to our Director of Advocacy, Sue Brown, and I'm happy to put you in contact with her. But more broadly, it's important to note that the approval of projects like this are threatening BC's emission targets, our environment, Indigenous women and girls' lives and rights, and increasing the violence and genocide they already experience, and in the context of broad-scale approval, and it really threatens the ability of British Columbians, all of us, to enjoy the full fulfillment of our rights. But happy to put you in contact with Steve.
All right, yeah, you won.
Hi, this is for Commissioner Govender. How will you be using these baselines to establish that actual change happens over the next 3 years? And for people, a lot of the key issues like lack of affordable housing and health and equity, those of us living here in BC are aware and advocates have been fighting for. Do you think this change can happen on a provincial level, or does the federal government will need to step in and help with that as well?
I think you've got two questions in there, so maybe I'll answer them in two pieces. So how are we going to measure change over time? And in terms of housing, is it just a provincial issue? Maybe I'll start with the second one actually, which is to say that housing and homelessness, I think, requires a response that is integrated between all on all levels of government. And particularly it's an area in terms of homelessness and encampment response is an area we've done a lot of work in, and I think very much requires the province and local governments to work closely together to not just solve the encampments, quote unquote, but to actually respect the human rights of encampment residents. In terms of measuring progress over time, we certainly these issues are big issues in our province. We don't expect to see them solved over the course of 3 years. But what we've tried to do here is really get very clear on what indicators we're relying on. So the statistics, the numbers that back up, as well as then going to community and having those real world conversations. So I'm hoping that by really understanding these issues at a more granular level, we'll be able to see small changes over time that will ultimately contribute to the bigger goals. Thank you.
Hi, my question is also for the commissioner. So how do these 10 issues differ around the province? Obviously, housing, access to healthcare looks very different in the lower mainland compared to northern rural communities or in the island.
Yeah, so we, as part of this larger project, we also did deeper dives in 4 communities around the province and released community briefs over the last number of months into those areas. They were really just some examples, some opportunities for us to connect deeply with community and hear what's happening in the 4 corners of the province, really diverse communities. I learned 2 things in that process. One is how incredibly consistent some of the stories are, and the issues that emerge in this report, Rights in Focus, really reflect that provincial perspective of how, even no matter how diverse our communities are, people are struggling with issues around housing, around toxic drug supply, and so on. The other thing I learned though is about the specificity and how some of those issues show up in different ways. So, for example, I was really struck by food security issues in Cranbrook, and thinking through how those show up, the issues of people trying to access food in that community. So then we also did see some differences for sure as we went across the province.
Great, any more hands in the room?
I don't want to hop mic. Perhaps this is kind of for everyone up there. It's the same in journalism. If you put out a big story, you worry it's going to be like screaming into a void that nobody hears. How worried are you that, being in kind of this ivory tower kind of atmosphere and putting out a report like this perhaps falls on deaf ears outside of this institution?
Maybe I'll start and then if anybody else has contributions. I think we're trying to guard against this being lost in the noise. Is a couple of pieces. One, importantly, we've worked really closely with community members in a variety of different ways through broad research methods like polls and surveys, but also by speaking directly to community. And I think there are community organizations and advocates across the province that will be looking to use this report and amplify it in their communities and their work. And that's one key way that this report, I think, will stay alive and really inform the development of human rights in the province. The other way is through conversations like we're having here. We are also doing, aside from media, we're also doing a webinar to explain this report more thoroughly to those who are interested. And it will form the basis of much of our work over the next 3 years. So whether this report itself is the piece that somebody reads, or it's the development of one of these issues into a set of recommendations over the next number of years, either way, this report forms the foundation for much of the work of the Commissioner's Office over the next few years.
I think the different quality of this report than some is that it isn't just a report that's based on research that is done outside the realm of what's happening on the ground. I mean, we need that research. At the same time, this report has come from people who are actually not only doing organizing work in their communities, but who are actually experiencing the injustices that are taking place. So I think that communities have already been doing this work in different ways, but having the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner amplify, I don't even like that word anyway, make people know more about what's going on and what the issues are, it just strengthens that work for people. They feel that that support is there, their voice is being heard, and it just, in my experience, certainly in Northern British Columbia, it increases the determination to carry out that work. So it's in that sense, I think the grants that were done in community to give voice directly to people who are experiencing these issues and these injustices really makes a huge difference. That way of working, I think, develops the movement for change that we're all passionate about.
All right, any other questions? Seeing no more hands? All right, then we'll call it a day, folks. Thank you so much for your questions, for your time, for coming out today. If anyone would like to follow up with a one-on-one with the commissioner, she'll be available in this room until about 11, wherever the conference room goes. And of course, if any further questions arise, or if you'd like to schedule something later on, especially for folks online, you can always contact our office for media@bchumanrights.ca, and we'll get right back to you. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, our speakers, and thank you as well to those watching online, and especially for those who came out today. Have a great rest of your day. If you want to find that report, that's again at bchumanrights.ca/in-focus. bchumanrights.ca/in-focus. Thank you.